Okay, I have a few observations. Let me start with first. One, my involvement in the South was trivial and tiny. Maybe 10 weeks seems short to you, but the time I spent in Alabama was a whole lot less. I'm happy to talk about it, but I don't think it should be compared to the danger and the risks that many other people did. But I'd like to begin by thanking this group and this organization. The idea that there'd be a Judeo-Christian group again, working, dealing with civil rights issues, is incredibly moving to me. You know, I started in a March on Washington as a kid. My father was a minister, and he ended up there too. We ran into each other by accident. But, and what was interesting was there were many people wearing collars and many people wearing yarmulkes. And my father, who was a Protestant minister and was not a Catholic and wouldn't have worn a collar ever, wore it for all civil rights demonstrations. He thought it was important to connect religion. And I watched that in March on Washington in 1963, and it moved me greatly. And it reinforced a lot of the things that I really care about in terms of how the movement would operate. But what was also important for me to understand was that the March on Washington was a happy time. It was a joyous time. People were pleased. They felt positive. They thought they were winning. And 3 weeks later, they blew up the 16th Street Baptist Church, and everything changed. But there was that one happy moment. It was a religious experience without regard to what anybody's religion was. My experience in the South, my only experience in Mississippi summer, was I applied to SNCC, and they had a meeting and interview schedule, and I failed. I'm probably the only person here who was actually rejected by SNCC. SNCC, after an interview, concluded that I didn't meet the essential requirements of nonviolence. And they came out to tell me, and I'm in the hall, and I had behaved perfectly. I knew the questions, I'd written the test, I knew the answers, and I was enraged that anybody would suggest that I didn't meet the test. So I demanded a rehearing. I wanted to go back in, and I am quite emphatic, and they said no. And what happened was, after I left, somebody said, well, maybe how you handled rejection. Which was not a foolish thing to say, because I've never handled rejection well. But their conclusion was not that I was not violent, but that I could be too confrontational. So SNCC rejected me. But then I ended up going to Selma. And Selma, of course, is actually after the Mississippi summer. It was a totally different experience. It was in Alabama. And there are several things about Selma, but I want to start with one observation, because this is a Judeo-Christian group. The group that was down there involved almost exclusively Selma high school students. The people who were beaten up on the bridges were just high school students. And there were John Lewis was there and a few others, but no big name people, and they were beaten up. And then there was a call for help, and King sent out a call for help. And on the final march, there were about 3,000 people, and about 400 or 500 more who were white. The rest were really the very big name, prominent people, and the rest high school students. But of the whites, they were overwhelmingly yarmulkes, more than collars, and the religious movement there was incredibly close. And one of the really painful, incredibly sad things is the division that has followed when it was a Judeo-Christian movement, black and white together, and everybody was standing with everybody, and there was a great fondness. I think part of it had to deal with affirmative action and tensions about quotas as opposed to finding ways to integrate, and maybe those problems were unavoidable, but they caused great pain and great difficulty, and the movement as a whole has suffered because of the divisions that have since come and taken place. And I think we all ought to remember that. Okay, now, my going to Selma. I went to Selma because of the publicity about the assault on the bridge. And I was also Joe's age. I was 20, I was incredibly brave. I knew nobody could hurt me. I had no fear whatsoever of anything. When people tell you we went down there to risk our lives, we didn't know it, because I knew I could withstand anything. And so we actually drove down after the first beatings, when Martin Luther King asked for people to come down, and that's when the whites showed up. Before that, it was an all-black operation, and as I think Cappy said, no, I think Mary said, having whites there was a protection for blacks. It also meant it was safer for whites. But when we were down there, we eventually pulled in to the Brown's Chapel. By the way, it's even hard to find out how to get to Brown's Chapel because the only people driving on the roads were white, and they didn't even know where Brown's Chapel was. And if they did know, they didn't really care very much about getting into the black community that was there. But I had some of the similar observations Mary had. We would go in, and we actually saw the local black high school. It was on cement blocks, with chickens underneath it. We were put up in a Baptist church on Jeff Davis Highway, right on the corner away from Brown's Chapel. That was a little scary because there were actually bullet holes in the window, which seemed a little more real than I expected. But even then I was brave because I knew they couldn't hit me. And we got together and had our march, and it was really a tense but not scary time because Lyndon Johnson had brought in the National Guard. There were helicopters, there were snipers in trees, there was a great deal of protection, although there were also a lot of quite offensive, totally disgusting remarks being shouted at. The one I do remember was there was a very heroic marcher who was missing one leg, and he's marching along, and the Confederates on the side would go, left, 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 left. And he would salute and wave as he would move along with his crutch. An odd collection and an odd experience. But one of the things that have also humbled me was many of the stupid things that I did, one of which I will really never forget. We're going over the bridge, and I've decided it's black and white together. So I decided to hold the hand of the black woman walking next to me. Well, she was really 16 years old. I was 19. I holding her hand, she shows no interest in holding mine. She's walked along, but I felt there was a deep commitment. So I was going to be there making a statement of principle for myself and her. And we did the entire 8-mile walk. Her hand was tough. She was a sharecropper's daughter. We got to the end. We then got driven back to Selma to get our cars because most of the marchers, only 300 marchers could go the whole way. This road wasn't wide enough. And I got in the car and I told my college roommate, I said, man, I was holding this woman's hand the whole way. My friend said, what were you doing? He said, I said, black and white together. We're going to show them. He said, you're going to show them. I said, yeah. He said, you're leaving. She's staying there. I'm saying, oh. I was so oblivious to any of the realities that were going on that I felt like I had exposed somebody. And I've gone back quite a few times for reunions, kind of hoping, but I've never found her. But the end of this was, the Voting Rights Act really came out of Selma. And Selma, for me, is a remarkable experience because everybody thought it was just another event. Mississippi Summer didn't think there wouldn't be a Mississippi Summer 65, 66, 67. Selma would go on, things would keep happening. But because they killed people before, during, and after Selma, and because they were clergy they were killed, Johnson was able to get the voting rights passed. And that was the Voting Rights Act that did make most of the impact for quite a period of time. And there's a sort of footnote to all of this. He ends up giving a speech to the joint session of Congress, ending up with a statement, and think of it in his Texas drawl, and we shall overcome. And he gets gets a round of applause, and he walks out. And then somebody said, great job, you did a terrific job. He said, yes, but I've just given the South to the Republican Party for the next 2 generations.
Yeah.